Hello, friends of Early Music New York. My name is Dongsok Shin, and I've had the pleasure and privilege to perform with Frederick Renz and EMNY over many years, particularly with the EMNY Orchestra of Original Instruments, formerly known as New York's Grand Band, or Grandy Bandy, as we would say affectionately. I have been also variously a recording producer, engineer, and editor for almost a dozen recordings of the various groups that fall under EMNY's banner. Today, I'm here to tell you about and perform a well-known piece of Johann Sebastian Bach, written for but rarely heard on the instrument it was probably conceived for. Johann Sebastian Bach passed away on July 28, 1750 in Leipzig, Germany. An inventory of his estate, a necessarily cold, dry listing of one's earthly possessions, was taken and dated November 11 of that same year. Such a list gives tantalizing hints of his family and professional life, how much cash was on hand, what silverware was in the house, what books he owned. And in Category 6, there is a list of 19 musical instruments, 8 of them keyboards, and of those, 2 are Lautenwerks, or lute harpsichords. Despite Bach's apparent fondness for this instrument, no historical examples survive from the Baroque period, only written descriptions. What is a Lautenwerk? It is simply a type of harpsichord with primarily gut instead of metal strings. Jakob Adlung, in his Musical Mechanics for the Organist, published in 1768, described it as the most beautiful of all keyboard instruments after the organ, because it imitates the lute not only in tone quality, but also in range and delicacy. As an aside, Adlung mentions the Katzenwerk right before the Lautenwerk, where cats are arranged in order of pitch. How was that determined, I wonder? And played by a keyboard that jabs thorns into the poor cat's tails. He does conclude it is an impractical instrument. Johann Friedrich Agricola, in an annotation to Adlung's book, added, "The editor of these notes remembers having seen and heard a Lauten clavicymbal in Leipzig in about 1740, designed by Mr. Johann Sebastian Bach and made by Mr. Zacharias Hildebrand, which was smaller in size than a normal harpsichord, but in all other respects similar. It had 2 choirs of gut strings and a so-called little octave of brass strings. It is true that in its normal setting, that is, when only one stop was drawn, it sounded more like a theorbo than a lute. But if one drew the buff stop, such as is found on a harpsichord, together with a 4-foot brass-strung stop, which was undamped, one could almost deceive professional lutenists." Since there are no surviving examples of lute harpsichords, though there are descriptions of them from all over Europe, every individual maker's lute harpsichord is that maker's interpretation of the surviving written descriptions plus the maker's imagination. American builders of lute harpsichords include Willard Martin, Keith Hill, and Stephen Sorley. The double keyboard Lautenwerk used in this performance was built by Anden Huben of Tuscaloosa, Alabama in 1997. The instrument has 56 notes on keyboards with ebony-covered naturals and bone-topped sharps. The case is steam-bent poplar, and the soundboard is Sitka spruce with a lute-style rose carved directly into the board. The chinoiserie decoration was executed on a black ground by Pamela Gladding of Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania. Her botanically themed design covers the interior of the lid, the keywell and jack rail, using bronze powders and gold and silver leaf in the 18th century manner. The instrument is strung in a combination of plain gut and silver-wound lute strings tied to the many separate bridges. It has 2 strings per note, from the bottommost note for about 2/3 of its range, and then it has single strings from there to the top. Both keyboards pluck the same strings, but with different plucking points for different timbres. Stop levers allow the performer to engage and disengage the partial second choir of strings, which is only available on the lower keyboard. There is a buff stop, which can be engaged and is playable from either keyboard. This Lautenwerck is owned by Christine and Jerry Baker, who live in Wyoming, and I thank them for allowing me to use it. Concerning the piece by Johann Sebastian Bach that I will play in a few minutes, we have to confront the elephant in the room. Did Bach write any solo lute music? Around 1900, the case was made that there were about a half dozen works by Bach for solo lute. These determinations were based on the idea that various manuscripts, usually not in Bach's hand but copies, would have titles saying they were for lute. But the musicologist who proposed this theory didn't actually know what the Baroque lute of Bach's day was like, how it was strung, how it was tuned, and how it was played. In fact, none of Bach's lute pieces can be played on the lute of Bach's time, but this myth was perpetuated all the way to the Neue Bach-Ausgabe, or NBA, publication in 1982 of a volume containing works for Lauteninstrumente. However, that term, Lauteninstrumente, doesn't really directly translate well into English, but it covers the bases well. Could be a lute or a lute-type instrument. Again, the big issue is that none of Bach's so-called lute music can actually be played directly on the Baroque lute of Bach's day. Something always has to be modified, transposing the piece into a key that works on the lute or tuning the lute in non-standard ways. In fact, it has been increasingly realized since the 1980s that Bach's lute works are really pieces either in the style of lute music or, even more probable, for the Lautenwerck or lute harpsichord. The Prelude, Fugue and Allegro in E-flat of J.S. Bach is a case in point. The autograph manuscript, which, by the way, sold at auction in 2016 for over 2.5 million British pounds, has a title that says it is for the lute or harpsichord, but the instrument designations seem to have been added later, not in Bach's hand. And if one wished to perform this piece on an actual Baroque lute, too many rearrangements have to be made to do so. But of course, it falls very naturally on the keyboard and sounds wonderful on a Lautenwerck. I'd like to thank Frederick Renz, Daniel Guss, and Early Music New York for the opportunity to make this presentation and performance. I hope you enjoy it.